Thank you very much. I'm going to start right now. Thank you very much for having us here. We are really happy to present this paper in this very interesting seminar. As it is already mentioned, this paper is a joint work with Laura Alfaro from Harvard Business School and NDR, and Marcela Eslava from Universidad de los Andes. And to start, basically, this paper starts with a basic observation that it has been done here during the previous presentation several times, and is that emerging market economies are different. And those characteristics that make us different, what we are going to argue is that make us more vulnerable to the economic shocks caused by the COVID-19 crisis. In particular, employment in the emerging market economies are characterized by being more concentrated in informal and micro enterprises firms, and have certain characteristics that makes them more vulnerable in the case of a shock, like the extended lockdown that we suffer during the first 6 months of the pandemic. So, for instance, employment in the type of occupations that we perform in emerging market economies typically are characterized by are being less fit for telework and have a higher contact content of the occupation that makes easily that they become subject to certain type of restrictions of social distancing, for example. If to those characteristics, we also include that we suffer one, as Ricardo Hausmann mentioned yesterday, one of the most stringent lockdown in the world. The type of employment or the shock that receive employment in emerging market economies is going to be by far stronger than the one that we observe, for instance, in developed economies. So this is what we try to do in this paper. What we try to do in this paper is to use a framework that allows us to assess the vulnerability of employment and income to the COVID-19 crisis in the emerging market economies. So, and we are going to compare our results with a framework in which we also consider the possibility of of an developed economy, an economy with a structure of a developed economy. So we are going to account for several dimensions that make us and make employment in emerging economies more vulnerable, in particular, distribution of workers across sectors, firm-sized categories, formality status, and occupations. To account for the COVID-19 shock, we are going to take into account supply shocks that I'm going to explain later, but basically are lockdowns in certain sectors and others are not going to be affected. Demand shocks that are going to be the shocks related to the social distancing measures that customers take to prevent the spread of the COVID-19. And we also are going to take into account indirect effects related to linkages networks in the input-output structure in the economy. So we developed this accounting framework that I'm going to explain in detail later, and we applied that to data from Colombia. So Colombia is a typical emerging market economy, has a similar, its employment has several characteristics that are shared with other emerging market economies, and in particular from Latin America, and had detailed data that allow us to implement our accounting framework. After that, we are going to run an ex post analysis trying to compare how well our accounting framework performs compared to the observed outcomes that we have seen during 2020. So, in one nutshell, what we saw is that when we apply the lockdowns and the idiosyncratic demand losses by sector, there is a large fraction of workers that are in risk of losing their job because of the pandemic. About 60% of employment in Colombia, that is most than 12 million workers, and 40% of the value added are at risk. So this is a measure of economic exposure. This is not an actual measure of doses. Simply, we are saying how many workers are exposed. And this is caused basically because there are many informal workers and many workers in the small firms. When we compare this with a counterfactual simulation in which we keep the data, the Colombian data, but impose the US employment distribution, such that we mimic the distribution by sectors, firm size, and occupation, the size of the losses are much smaller, 17 and 11% respectively, 17 in employment and 11% in value added, so about 1/3 of what we observe, assuming the Colombian distribution. And when we relate these results with the observed job losses during the second quarter of 2020, that it is about 44% of hours worked were lost compared with the second quarter of 2019, 25% of jobs and 16% of economic activity in general. When we compare these measures with our measure of economic exposure, what we see is that about 50% of the variance of the hours lost were explained by our ex-ante measure of exposure, of economic exposure. And we try to pin down every element that we include in our measure of exposure. What we found is that lockdowns and informality explain the most. So going simply through the details of the model that we have, so our accounting framework in which we try to analyze the economic exposure to the COVID-19 crisis on employment and output, what we do is to try to analyze different sources of shock that affect differentially to certain workers in our data. So the sources of shock that we are going to consider associated to the COVID-19 first are what we call supply shocks, that are going to be basically lockdowns at the sectoral level between essential and non-essential sectors. So non-essential sectors are subject to lockdown. And depending on the characteristics of the workers, some workers are going to be also affected by this type of measures. For instance, workers that are or that performs in activities that requires high contact are more subject to restrictions to perform their activities. So they are going to be more exposed to lose their employment or job. And workers that have the ability to work from home are going to be less exposed. On the other hand, we have what we call the idiosyncratic demand shocks, that basically are the shocks caused by the reduction of the demand and due to changes in patterns from the consumers. And these are going to be at the sector level. I'm going to talk about the details of how we measure that in brief. And we are going to allow that those shocks are expanded or extended via the linkages, the input-output linkages to other sectors. So not necessarily one sector that it is affected. It is not affected by lockdown. It is not going to be affected by the economic shock, because if their suppliers or the sectors that they sell are affected, it is going to be affected, the sector. And on top of that, we are going to incorporate the aggregate demand shock to account for a generalized reduction in income, that it is going to be measured simply by a Keynesian multiplier. So the four dimensions that I already mentioned, and I'm going to mention again, related the determinants of economic risk, are going to be four characteristics of jobs. Basically, the first one is labor informality, that we are going to treat as under a legalistic view. So it's going to be lack of compliance with labor regulation. So, and the key element here is that the lack of compliance with labor regulation is going to exclude employment protection. So those workers are going to be most exposed given a shock. And in a recovery phase are going to be easily rehired. The firm size, as Francisco mentioned yesterday, smaller firms are more credit constrained. It is likely, evidence showed that they have lower cash reserves than larger formal firms. So in general, they are going to be less able to survive an extended lockdown. So we also put those workers that work in these type of firms as vulnerable. The economic sector, as I mentioned before, the economic sector is going to be key because essential sectors are going to allow to operate during the lockdown, while the non-essential sectors are going to have to stop activities on site. So they are going to be mainly affected by the lockdown directly. And the occupation is the dimension that gives us the type of factors that allow us mitigate or expand or the economic risk that the employment faces. So workers with that perform occupations that are fit for telework are less vulnerable to lose their job compared to workers that no. With this, quickly, to give some details of measurement that are going to be important, this measure that appears in the presentations as SPY is going to be our measure of economic exposure for each worker in a stage of the crisis, that we are going to label each worker I, a stage of the crisis T. So the shock, the economic shock that the worker faces is going to be the combination of a direct shock, that it is going to be the lockdown shock, that it is at the sector level, if the worker is in a sector in which the shock affects, and the demand loss used by the reduction of the demand. And that was one of the most difficult parts to measure, because basically we cannot separate or identify by separate the demand and the supply shock from countries that already suffered a lockdown. So what we used was Sweden production data and see how much the demand fall in each by sector. And because Sweden has a different economic structure, and in particular has a different type of workers and occupations, we adjust by the teleworkability that Sweden would have in each sector. So basically it's a net measure of to try to understand the economic losses in by sector in Sweden. That was one economy that didn't have a lockdown. After that, this shock is going to be extended by the input-output linkages. It can be extended if the person is in a high contact occupation, or mitigated if the person is able to telework, that it is going to be measured by this TI variable. All the shock is going to be amplified by the aggregate demand multiplier, and not the stage of the crisis is going to be characterized by this variable SIT. And this variable SIT is going to be one variable that allows us to switch on or off some the affectations on some workers. So some of the workers are going to be affected quickly, that it is our first shock that we think we simulate 3 scenarios. The first one, informal and micro firms are affected. In the second one, informal, micro, and small firms, firms with 50 workers or less, are affected. So trying to keep all these ideas of vulnerability that I mentioned before. And in the third one, we simulate a recovery phase in which formal and micro small firms are still affected, and informal firms come back, informal firms and jobs come back to work. So with these stages, we know that actually the shock is going to be more smooth, and is going to be the combination of these 3 stages. However, what we want to show is how the economic exposure changes depending on the stage of the crisis that we are talking about. So we apply, and quickly here, the input-output linkages are going to be the shocks, the direct shocks of each sector, weighted by the importance of each sector relative to other one, to another one, in the input-output matrix, and the aggregate demand is going to be computed based on the marginal propensities to consume by income group that we took from the United States, but because unfortunately we don't have good Colombian data to explore there. So we weight by the share of income that it is covered in Colombia relative to the characterization of marginal propensity to consume in the US. So with this idea in mind, we use information of the Colombian Household Survey, that it is national representative and is the official source of statistics of employment and employment characteristics in Colombia. One key element here is that we have information about occupation, but it is not in the same classification than the ACS in US. So we have to make some transformations, some correspondences, and to adjust the categories in the US that are the ones that have information for teleworkability and high contact occupation from Leibovici and co-authors and Dingel and Neiman. And what we put as an input by occupation is the share of American workers that report being fit for telework or in a high contact occupation, that according to our classification, the classification that appears in the Colombian data. So when we apply this framework to the data, what we saw is basically what we arced at the beginning of the presentation, and is that an emerging market like Colombia, compared as a developing with a developed economy like the US, basically is more vulnerable in all these aspects that we discussed before. So in general, compared to the US, the share of workers, this graph shows the share of workers in 2019 for Colombia, in the most recent year for the United States that we could get, in different characteristics or dimensions of vulnerability that characterize our supply shocks. So the employment in Colombia is more focused on self-employment, almost 45% of workers. It is more and it is more concentrated in small firms. Almost 70% of workers are at firms with less than 10, with 10 or less employees. And it are focused more in occupations with high contact compared with the US. In contrast, in the aspects that can mitigate the risk, Colombia fares worse. So we have a lower capability of telework, even though there are many workers that work at home. So these are going to be characteristics that are going to affect directly the economic exposure that an emerging market economy like Colombia is going to have compared to the economic structure of a developed economy like the US. So looking at the demands to the demand shocks, these are the implied demand shocks that we got based on the production losses in Sweden and adjusting by teleworkability again. So what we saw is that there is large heterogeneity by sectors. There are going to be some sectors that are going to face a direct hit really large, like accommodation and food services, or domestic workers, about 15% of production. And other sectors that are going to be less affected, like sectors related to administrative support work or professional scientific and technical services. So we put all this data in our framework, and we compute how many jobs are at risk and how much of value added are at risk compared to the baseline that is the baseline of 2019. So if the economy, what we are assuming basically is that if the economy wouldn't have that shock of the COVID-19 crisis, the economy would have exactly the same structure and size that the one that we observed in 2019. So in that case, what we see is that in the left panel, we have the jobs at risk compared to the baseline, and in the right panel, the value at risk compared to the baseline. We have three groups of bars that represent each group represents one stage of the crisis. So the early crisis, when the crisis deepens and affects more firms, and this recovery stage that I already mentioned. And the two bars in each group represents one, the distribution, the results that we obtain with the distribution of the actual data in Colombia. So this is the splitting between formal and informal, and the distribution that we get if we apply the US distribution to the Colombian data of distribution of employment. So what we observe is that first, there is a large fraction of workers that are at risk of losing their employment or their income, almost 60% of workers and almost 65% of workers in the worst part of the crisis. And most of them come from employment in informal firms or informal employment in general, and employment in small firms. And this is true also in value added in a small magnitude, because informal firms are less productive and in general are going to have less value added to the economy. So this is why the bars, the height of the bars, the magnitude of the losses are smaller. When we compare with the evolution of the economy with the United States, we see a deeper recession, but a fastest recovery, in the sense that informal economy is going to come back later, and that implies lower losses of employment in later stages of the crisis. So when we decompose the effect to try to understand what are the main determinants of the shock, what we observe is that the total effect is mainly driven by lockdowns. So what we do here is run simulations, exactly the same simulation, but shutting down one of the mechanisms at the time, and see how much of the economic exposure changes as long as we shut down one of the elements. So in our initial stage of the crisis, what we observe is that the lockdowns are the main driver of this effect. So almost 2/3 of the effect can be explained only 1/3 of the effect can be explained by the lockdowns. That doesn't imply that demand shocks are not important. Demand shocks are also important because still, even if we remove lockdowns, we are going to have a large employment losses or employment at risk due to the reduction of demand, and this generalized reduction accounted for in the Keynesian multiplier. So when we compare, and these last 3 minutes that I have, I'm going to compare what we observe with what we predict, the type of employment that is going to be more in risk. So what I present here is the reduction, is the actual employment losses in the second quarter of 2020. So these employment losses accounted in the second quarter by about 22% of employment. And if we take into account that there are many workers that didn't work during this period, so they report having a job but not working, so working 0 hours, the employment losses in total amount 36% of employment in Colombia during this period. This is more or less 7 million workers in the second quarter of 2020. So as we expected, and consistent with the idea that we had, the largest losses were observed in informal employment, in employment in small firms, and in sectors non-essential, in non-essential sectors. So the only surprising result here is that employment losses were smaller in self-employment, that it was only 12% in the second quarter of 2020. However, this is because many self-employed workers reported working 0 hours. They still have their jobs, but they couldn't go to the street to work. So in that case, if we account for these active jobs and working 0 hours in the second quarter, then the loss of self-employment is almost 25% compared to the second quarter of 2019. And again, this graph basically is a replication of the graph that yesterday was presented, and showed that the recovery of employment has been faster in Colombia in the second part of the year. Yet it is mostly driven by the recovery of informal employment rather than formal employment. That is going to take more time, and employment in small firms. So very consistent with our findings.
Oscar,
so 1 minute, right? So when we implement an empirical analysis very quickly, in which we compare the actual employment losses by sector with different aspects of our measure of exposure. And what we found is that our measure explains about between 40 and 50% of the employment measure that we check, and most of them is explained by almost half of them is explained by lockdowns. by the sectoral variation in lockdowns. So to conclude, what we discuss here is emerging markets are different. Our economic exposure is higher because of our economic structure and the prevalence of informal employment and micro firms. And lockdowns are going to have a big cost in terms of employment if we continue following this type of policy. So it is crucial for governments that use lockdowns at the last resort and try to move to more intelligent strategies, trying to first get back vaccines as fast as possible here, and second, continue the efforts and well-designed scale testing, tracing, and isolation, and the use of masks still is going to be necessary. So I'm going to stop here because my time is up, but thank you very much for being in the presentation, and we are really happy to answer any question. Thanks.
Thank you, Oscar. Very interesting presentation. I'm going to look for the question. There is no one posed to do a question.
It's too early.
Any question? It was really clear.
Rosana, I have a question.
Okay.
Andres here. So thank you, Oscar. Very interesting. Two things actually. One is you, if I saw correctly, the difference between Colombia and the US in terms of the share of high contact jobs is not too big, right? There was one of the results that showed that despite the large differences in informality. So do you have any idea of what accounts for this? Because you would expect that informality being so prevalent and being informality more prone to high contact, then you would expect this difference between the US and Colombia being much larger. And then, so you did stress that aggregate demand is still important. It's not just the lockdown, but it was not clear to me in the end how relatively important it is compared to lockdowns. So can you elaborate more on this, please?
Okay. So first, the differences between high contact occupations in the US and Colombia, I think that it is the main difference is because of the construction of the measure. So we built our measure based on Leibovici and co-authors from the US St. Louis Fed, and they give a measure of high contact occupations by occupation in the United States. So their measure is already high. So when we apply that to our data, that is going to be basically a lower bound because we actually, as you mentioned, informality is going to have a higher contact component compared to the US. So in that sense, we are working right now thinking about a different way to approach this and try to obtain more variation on this variable. Because yes, from the variables that we are seeing, that is the variable that exhibits lower variance within occupations. And it is because from the sign, from the beginning, this variable exhibits lower variance. And the second one, the relative importance of aggregate demand. So when we come back here, what we observe in our simulation, this is the simulation in which we remove one of the elements at the time. So what we observe here is that aggregate demand by itself explain, if we remove aggregate demand of our analysis, it explains about 13 percentage points if we leave lockdowns. But the problem here is that we have here in our model a nonlinearity in which one sector cannot be more affected by the lockdown, given the lockdown. If it is closed, the demand shock doesn't matter. So that is why the employment losses or the economic exposure when we remove demand is not as important as, for example, in the case in which we remove lockdowns. Anyways, if we remove lockdowns, the only shocks that remains are the idiosyncratic demand shocks and the aggregate demand shocks that amplify those shocks, the idiosyncratic demand. So we can say that in absence of lockdowns, the idiosyncratic demand shocks are going to account for 2/3 of the economic exposure that we check, that we compute from the data. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes. Did you try to exploit the fact that the household survey has is in several cities to correlate the epidemiological dynamics with the timing of the lost jobs, and to check if urban areas with a bigger outbreak had more job losses, which goes back to the discussion yesterday about the efficiency of lockdowns.
I agree. We haven't checked. We haven't exploited that heterogeneity from rural versus urban areas. One thing that happened in Colombia is that the lockdown was generalized for all the country. And that meant that some local authorities had the opportunity to put stricter lockdowns in the regions. So we haven't, but at least we are in the lower bound. But still, we haven't checked the differences in employment between rural and urban areas. So basically, the lockdown was the same for everybody, but we haven't checked.
But no, the question is whether the compliance with the lockdown is not full. Mm-hmm. So there might be one city in the survey that has less mobility or less lockdown than another city.
Yeah. I think that we haven't checked, but as far as I remember looking for the Google mobility data, most of the main cities comply very strictly with the lockdown, but I haven't checked compared to rural areas. So yes, we have to check.
Okay.
So Andy, I think you're a little bit suggesting the exercise that Chad did in the US, exploiting differences in lockdowns and compliance. As Oscar said, it's very difficult to do in Colombia because the policy was de jure more national, and de facto, I think people tend to forget that in general, Latin America is very urban, and very services. So that's one thing, but also these mobility measures, they tend also to pick up mostly cities. It's very hard to get this Google and Waze and all of that in rural area because of the way the data is measured. I see your point that there might be differences in compliances, but these measures, A, are hard to pick them up, and B, for actual employment and overall GDP, it's also not that relevant. Again, most of the economic activity is in urban.
But different urban areas are different. Anyway.
I thought Andy's point.
But not in the case of Colombia. In Colombia, as Oscar said, the big cities had similar. But we have received this comment before, and we're trying to see if something can be done. But again, it's not easy to find those obvious differences, as has been done in big countries like the US, where clearly by state, there has been a lot of differences in terms of policy and also compliance.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about something that was said? In the middle of your presentation, you said that countries that have more informality, they have a deeper fall in employment, but also they will recover faster. And that's a property that I've seen in dynamic models as well. It's an interesting thing to. So can you elaborate on that? And then related to the question, right now there is a lot of policy proposals in our countries, asking for, say, some reforms that are going to reduce informality. But from the viewpoint of that particular statement, that would mean that these reforms would actually slow employment recovery. So what kinds of trade-offs can you actually identify in your model and in that regard? That's the question.
Yes. So basically, our point with informality is that informal employment in general is characterized by having low social capital and lower adjustment cost. Organizational capital, I'm sorry. So it means that in the presence of a shock like the one that we observe, the firing and hiding costs are lower than compared to the counterpart in the formal sector. So in general, when we lose an informal job, it is easy to recover when the economy recovers. And yes, this is one of the properties, dynamic properties, that many papers in the literature have found before in the onset of different crises, especially or shocks. For instance, trade shocks, and that the informality is the buffer that allow adjust the employment in these economies. So once I say that, I would like to say that it is not necessarily a good outcome, because informal employment typically is also a low quality employment with without social protection, with low productivity, and it basically can hurt growth in the long run, or delay growth in the long run. So in short, what I want to say is that once there is this type of shocks, and one of the calls in the policy lessons of the paper that we have is that the governments not only have to protect the livelihood of informal workers that couldn't work during this crisis, but also had to protect formal sector jobs, because they are really rare. They are really scarce in our economies, and are the good ones. So if we want to take the advantage of this crisis to improve the characteristics of labor market in the labor markets in our economies, policies that are oriented to reduce barriers to formality, to reduce these adjustment costs that formal firms faces, can leave us in a better outcome in which we have a more formal economy at the end.
Let me add a little bit. In the paper, we do this analysis for number of employment jobs, but also value added. And so informality is associated with a lot of jobs, but relatively less value added. So the recovery of informality, as Oscar said, is lower quality, because it's going to have a lot of jobs, but not necessarily output, productivity, income. To the point of policy, I do think we need to spend some time, especially the policymakers, how we're going to get out of this. At least in my country, there's now a lot of proposals to tax, increase social security to help the health system, but people were not paying it before. So this is most likely going to increase informality more than improve it. And so I think this is a trade-off that needs to be thought. Having said that, I do think there are good examples in the region. I think Brazil in the 2000s and 2010s managed to increase formality. I think it's a successful example. with many policies. There's papers that are trying to explain it, and it doesn't seem to be one thing. But one of the things they have done is some changes in the regulation to try to foster formality. And I think that this is something we need to spend some time thinking about once this is over. Because as was mentioned yesterday, this still is not over. I think we have at least 6 more bad months and then a very sluggish recovery.